All right, folks, welcome back. This is going to be the last part of our notes on chapter 27 on the Cold War. Some big things today we want to cover, so we'll get into that in a moment. Just getting done watching Fauci talk about the coronavirus. That's always encouraging. So, yeah, we're all doomed. Anyway, uh, so let's talk a little bit about America and some of the changes that are going on after the war. America is being kind of born, at least as we recognize it, um, after World War II here. Okay, so we're going back to immediately that post-war period. There's that famous picture of the sailor picking a random nurse to kiss once he's home from the war. That's Times Square in 1945. Uh, that nurse actually, I think it was her, that nurse actually just died last year. There was a big story in the news about it. I don't know about that guy, but anyway, that was an iconic image from the happy ending of World War II for America anyway. So uh, here's some issues. So all of a sudden, we got millions of folks coming back home after the war that are going to have to be reintegrated into the economy, right? Into the job market. Some people are going to go back to jobs they had before. Others are going to make careers out of the military because they were very successful during their time in the military. Others are going to go to college. Others are going to settle down with families. So there's all these big issues and things that we got to deal with as soon as the war is over. Now, I mentioned, uh, unemployment at this time is very, very low. Okay, we've got about between 1% and 2% unemployment after the war is over. Now, that's immediately going to go up because suddenly there's just all these more people in the workforce. So we got to deal with that problem because it's going to be a very sudden and quick economic change. So that's something that we really got to handle effectively. One way we do this is through the creation of the GI Bill. So the GI Bill provided money to soldiers that fought in the war. It's kind of like the World War II version of the bonuses that the folks that fought in World War One were due to get. Uh, but the GI Bill gave money to folks that fought in the war that they could use one of two ways, and it still exists today. The GI Bill could be money that could be used towards um, going to college to defer your cost of college for former soldiers. The other thing they could do is take that money, put a down payment on a new home. That would be a way to, get with their families and wives and all that stuff, and then keep the economy humming because those that choose to get a home out of the GI Bill are suddenly going to find themselves with a home that needs to be built. So we see a big growth in homes being built as a result of this as well. So that's one piece of the reconversion puzzle. Now, the other side of this is going to result in a lot of significant labor unrest. So I want to think back for a minute to chapter 24, where we talked about the New Deal and the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, uh, and how it gave all these new rights to strengthen the rights of unions. Well, it's 1947 now. Roosevelt is dead. Truman is president. Truman not as liberal as Roosevelt was. So as a result of that, not quite as friendly to now Truman. Now let me get this right for you, right? Now Truman is not quite as friendly to socialist ideas as Roosevelt is, but he's still a friend to a lot of these ideas. Okay. Now, furthermore, in 1947, at this time, Congress, for the first time since before Roosevelt was president, now both houses of Congress are controlled by Republicans. Republicans certainly don't want socialist policy, and they view unions as a tool of socialism to a certain degree. So the Taft-Hartley Act, the goal of the Taft-Hartley Act is to go out there and to attempt to weaken as much as possible the influence and power of labor unions. Um, They want to be able to help with the retransition of workers into jobs and labor intensive jobs like factories and things like that. Um, what it does specifically, most notably, is it outlaws something called the closed shop. We should all remember what a closed shop is. The closed shop is the union that all that you have to be, to work in a certain place, you have to be a member of the union. Okay? They outlaw the closed shop, which means that you don't have to be a member of that union to get a job at a place. Now, some places still required you to join a union after you got the job, but you didn't have to be a union member to get the job to begin with. So no more closed shops. And this significantly weakens the influence and power of labor unions. Again, outlawing closed shops significantly weakens the power and influence of labor unions. Okay? Why do we do this? Because all the folks working in unions, many of them minorities, see all the white guys coming back from the war and say, we're going to lose our jobs. They don't want to lose their jobs. And there's lots of labor unrest and problems in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Okay, so they don't want to lose their jobs and all that stuff. And, what we have is a bunch of labor riots and unrest throughout the country. Another problem here of reconversion. Taft-Hartley is meant to fix that problem, at least to some degree, by outlawing the closed shop and then weakening the power of labor unions. So those are two big issues with reconversion after the war. And now let's talk a little bit about the election of 1948. Now, we have been under remember, this is 1948. The last time a presidential election was won by anybody not named Franklin Roosevelt was 1928. Even though Truman had been the president for much of Roosevelt's fourth term, because he died shortly into it, people are seeking a great deal of change. Most people thought, we'll get to the fair deal in a minute. Most people thought Truman was going to lose. He's running against a guy named Thomas Dewey, and and people thought that Truman, it was just time for a change, not have a Democrat, get a Republican in there. Miraculously, somehow, Truman manages to win re-election. There's a famous picture of him holding a newspaper headline from the Chicago Tribune that said Dewey defeats Truman. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Truman won re-election by a fairly close margin in terms of votes. He certainly didn't win an easy re-election in 1948. But anyway, we get Truman for 4 more years. And his number one objective during this time is something he calls the fair deal. Kind of like the square deal that Roosevelt had. Truman wants to provide a fair deal to all American people. The fair deal makes several proposals. Okay? Am I going too fast? The fair deal makes several proposals. Some of them are ahead of their time. Some of them aren't very practical for this moment, but they set the stage for future objectives of democratic government. I'm going to give you 5 or 6 of them right now. 6 of them, okay? Number 1, he wants to make the Fair Employment Practices Commission permanent. That's the thing that A. Philip Randolph did that gave fair employment opportunities to African Americans and other minorities and women. He wanted to make that a permanent thing. So that's objective number 1, make the Fair Employment Practices Commission permanent. That essentially happened. He was the first to suggest and pursue a form of universal health care. That's number 2. Did that happen? Obviously not. It's still something we talk about a lot today. Number 3, he vowed to increase the minimum wage. At this time, that works. The minimum wage is increased, and obviously it continues to increase since. I think they wanted, and don't quote me on it, was something like he wanted to go it from 45 to 85 cents an hour or something like that. But anyway, the amount doesn't matter. So that worked out. He proposes significant civil rights legislation. Now, a lot of this doesn't work out. Part of it had already happened with the desegregation of the military in 1947, but he proposes significant civil rights legislation. Some works out, some of it doesn't, but it's something else that helps in the movement towards the civil rights movement that starts in the 1950s and moves on to the 1960s from there. Okay, so we're pursuing a lot of things here as Truman, very forward thinking and ideas that are a little bit ahead of their time in terms of social programs and ideas to help people. Number 5, he proposes price controls for housing. This works to a certain degree. We see this happen more in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Don't worry about that. Apparently not going to be on your AP exam. But essentially, price controls are what we refer to today as like projects or Section 8 housing, putting housing aside that is at a cheaper rate for people that don't have as much money, so we can kind of control the amount of prices of rents and things that people would have to pay. If you get grandfathered in, meaning like if you're paying a certain amount in rent at one time and the rent goes up and you're not making any money, say you're like an older retired person, your rent isn't going to increase with that. So that's the idea of price controls. Again, if you don't understand this stuff, ask me when we get together again on Zoom tomorrow or Thursday. Finally, this one didn't work out at this time either. He asked for a repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act. Republicans in Congress, far too powerful at this time, don't want to repeal Taft-Hartley. That's not going to happen just yet. So those are the 6 big things of Truman's Fair Deal. Hopefully you get that. So again, what we see at the end of the day, if you put this all into kind of one big idea, is a renewed federal commitment to pursuing civil rights objectives, right? Price controls, it helps the poor and elderly, many of them minorities, civil rights legislation, minimum wage, Taft-Hartley, healthcare, all those things are aimed to a certain degree at minorities and people of financial disadvantage. Okay. As scary as the bombs were, and the bombs were scary, that's scary. There was a great deal of optimism about the possibility of what nuclear or atomic power can do. The 1950s would be a time when we're terrified of the possibility of the bomb. Movies show us how scary they can be. Kids in schools, have to go to practice bomb shelters. I'll send you a video of a bomb shelter video. They have kids go hide underneath your desk, like if a nuclear bomb dropped near you, like your school, like, oh, that desk, that's going to keep me safe. That's going to do it. Good one. Anyway, but there was a lot of optimism too about the possibility of what could be done with nuclear power. People are thinking this can be used to replace gasoline for cars. It can be cleaner forms of energy. It can make things work faster. It can be an unlimited forms of energy and power that we can use in an unlimited number of ways. So despite the fears that were definitely there throughout the Cold War about the bad possibilities that can happen with nuclear power, there's some positives as well. Now here's the map of the election in 1948, relatively close in terms of percentage. The incumbent Truman only won by about 4%. He wins pretty handily in the electoral vote, but that kind of gives you a map. We get about 53% of people voting in this election, which is more associated with the numbers that you'd get today. All right, and that Strom-Thurmond vote, and once he got those, probably, depending on those states, would have been split. They probably would have gone to pretty evenly between Dewey and Truman. So who knows where those 39 would have gone and how that might have changed things, but probably not much. All right, moving on. So let's talk about the Red Scare, or the Red Iceberg as it's pictured down here. Let's talk about the beginnings of the Red Scare. I'm going to send you a couple of videos too associated with this one that I want you to take a look at, and then we can talk about it a little bit when we have our discussion tomorrow or Thursday. Anyway, so why are we skeptical of communism between 1945 and 1950? Well, the same reason we're skeptical of communism from 1919 and the early 1920s. We're seeing governments be toppled by communism. We're hearing a little bit about some of the horrible things that happen in communist countries. There's lots of reasons to not like communism. The most important one really being we're a democracy. We believe in a free market. Socialists or communists believe that in a command economy, that the government should control all the ways and means of producing and building your economy up. So it's the exact opposite of what we believe as a country, and our skepticism of communism is pretty well founded in that regard. We saw what happened in the Red Scare, not too good. We're also weary of how things might go with more socialized things that we're seeing from what's the stuff that Roosevelt's doing. Okay, so there is a great deal of skepticism in regards to communism during this time. Part of the reasons we get increasingly skeptical is the way it's handled in the government. Okay, lots of people are accused of being communists. In fact, HUAC, which stands for the House Un-American Activities Committee, is formed in 1947 to root out suspected communists in our government and in the United States. Other examples of skepticism in our country at this time. Books are being banned from libraries that talk about questionable or communist ideas. For instance, Robin Hood, the story of Robin Hood, was banned in a lot of libraries around the country because people thought the idea of robbing from the rich and giving to the poor sounded too communist. Okay? Our fears get increased when the House Un-American Activities Committee uncovers the story of Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was allegedly a guy that in the late 1930s sold government secrets to the Soviet Union. And this became a big deal. Now, Hiss didn't get in trouble for this specifically because the statute of limitations had run out. This was in 1937-38. By now we're talking about 10 years later. Statute of limitations is anywhere from 7 to 9 years, depending on the crime. Okay? But it does create a lot of skepticism and fear because this guy works for the government. If we have communists that have infiltrated and work in the government, we have a lot to be afraid of, right? So he had these things that are called the pumpkin papers that were all these alleged secrets being sold to the communists. They were called the pumpkin papers because the guy that he took them to, he hid them in like a fake pumpkin in the guy's garden. So this creates a lot of fear, okay? Now, Hiss ultimately does go to prison for perjury. He ultimately does go to prison for perjury because he's accused of and then convicted of lying about his alleged communist involvement, which of course he denies. The person responsible for really going after him and one of the big figures in HUAC is a future president by the name of Richard Nixon, number 37, right? President number 37, Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon. Now, aside from that, the House Un-American Activities Committee also goes after Hollywood. Hollywood is a big source of entertainment and information for people. Therefore, it has a great deal of influence on people's opinions and ideas. The idea of the Hollywood 10, essentially, who were they? They were 10 Hollywood writers and producers that essentially pled the fifth or refused to talk when questioned about whether or not they were communists. So they were blacklisted or kicked out of Hollywood, essentially, along with many other Hollywood people, including some actors. Frank Sinatra, for instance, was somebody that got accused of having suspicious ties. He wasn't a communist. He may have been involved with the mob, but he certainly wasn't a communist. And this really negatively impacted the careers of a lot of people in Hollywood. Richard Nixon, again, was a big figure in going after these folks. And the president of the Screen Actors Guild at that time was also somebody who really pursued rooting out communism in Hollywood. This guy was an actor by the name of Ronald Wilson frickin' Reagan. So, you know, moment of appreciation and silence for that great, wonderful man. Oh, God, if we only had him today. Anyway, so the Hollywood 10 cast skepticism upon Hollywood. Hollywood has a great deal of influence over people's opinions through films that are made. We got to make sure that the movies that we're making don't support communist ideas. That's the general thought behind seeking out Hollywood as places where there's suspected subversion, communist subversion. Movies can brainwash people into believing this and that. We don't want that to happen. Okay, we talked about Nixon already. This is where Nixon becomes famous. This is where Nixon makes a name for himself. So much so that in 1952, he becomes a running mate to Dwight D. Eisenhower and becomes one of the youngest vice presidents we've ever had. Okay. Truman also comes out and supports something called the Federal Loyalty Program, essentially something where people have to pledge their loyalty to the United States to prove that they're not a communist. Two people that were accused of communism and convicted were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who allegedly, were convicted of selling secrets associated with the Manhattan Project, the project that created the atomic bomb, to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was much earlier than we thought able to test their first atomic or nuclear weapon, that made us very, very scared. The Rosenbergs allegedly masterminded this plan to sell these plans to the Soviet Union, to give these spies and give these plans to the Soviet Union. And even they're just a regular, everyday, older looking couple, they get executed by electric chair. Okay, we're terrified of communism. Another example is the McCarthy Internal Security Act. Basically, this shows our increasing fear of what we call communist subversion. If you don't know what that means, subversion is just the idea of communists making their way into the United States and causing all kinds of problems. All right, so the McCarthy Internal Security Act required organizations to register with the United States to essentially prove that they weren't communist. Why is this such a big deal? Well, because it's an attack on civil rights and liberties that people are expected to have. Last slide, we talked about Truman pursuing the growth of civil rights for people in the Fair Deal. Now, because of our fears regarding communism, we're seeing those ideas and those freedoms being shoved aside. Okay? I know this is getting to be a long one, but anyway, let's talk a little bit about Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism. And I think this is probably going to be our last big point for this one. I want you to listen closely to McCarthyism. I'm also going to send you a couple of videos, links to some of the stuff I talk about here. So Joe McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, and he wants to get reelected because he's a senator, and that's what senators do. They want to get reelected. So he needs a hot button issue to ensure his reelection. What is that issue? Communism. McCarthy produces this list where he claims that he has a list of 205 State Department employees, in other words, government employees that are communist. 205 State Department employees that are communist. And he goes all over giving speeches, making accusations, calling all these different people communists. Everybody from members of Congress to other State Department officials to generals in the military, making all these accusations about people. Problem is, whenever he waves this list of names that he has of these 205 communists, he never actually produces a single name from the list. This, of course, causes some doubt. McCarthy takes his crusade to television, where in the Army McCarthy hearings, I'll give you a link to that. In the Army McCarthy hearings, he basically gets destroyed by a military panel for causing all these problems. The famous line was that, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, in making these accusations, blah, blah, blah." You'll hear that in the thing. And then in the popular news show at the time, a show called See It Now with Edward R. Murrow, who was like the #1 newsman of the day, they put him on the show, and Murrow asked him all these questions about communism. They make him look really bad with the lighting, and they edit it in a way to make McCarthy look like he's lying and make him look really, really bad, which he was. And then Murrow on television further destroys the credibility of Joe McCarthy. Ultimately, McCarthy loses his reelection bid, is out of government, and he dies within about 3 or 4 years as a lonely drunk. So that didn't work out too well for him. But what McCarthy does here is he preys on the fears of Americans. He takes the ideas or the things that scare us most, and he tries to exploit those fears for his own gain. We still see people do that in politics today, whether it's talking about, the viruses, scams out there and stuff. You're talking about immigrants or the wall or other things. We see that exploitation still happen quite a bit. And McCarthy is kind of the first one to really do that sort of thing. All right. Again, just an image. from 1953 of the red iceberg. You've got there the countries with the headpieces here represent countries that have fallen to communism, and America is looming closer and closer to that dangerous red iceberg because we are terrified of communism. I'm sorry, folks, that is a long one, but that's it for the week. So anyway, hope everybody's well. Get a chance to watch this, please, so we can discuss on Thursday. And I will send you a couple other links to a couple of YouTube videos I want you to watch well. All right, be well, everybody. See you.